Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us here at Page Turners Plus. The last time you saw and heard from us, we were reflecting on Merle Collins' Ocean Stirrings. As promised, we have Merle Collins, and we'll be in conversation with her today. Welcome, Merle.
Thank you.
Yes, it's our pleasure to have you. And you're also our final guest and final book author of 2023 as well. So thank you for that. So, in our reflections, we were using Helen, Louise, Langdon, Norton, Little, and Ocean interchangeably. And for our viewers who may not have read the book as yet, they might be slightly confused. So, she already had a lot of names. Why did you give her yet another name, Ocean, in Ocean Stirrings?
Okay, well, thanks for that question. That's an excellent question. Um, and in a way, it goes to the heart of something that the critic Barbara Foley refers to as the documentary novel, and the fact that well, she wasn't the first to use the term, but she, according to her, the documentary novel locates itself on the border between factual discourse and fictive discourse. And it is not struggling to get out of one into the other. It wants to keep, it wants to stay on the border. So in a sense, that is happening in ocean stirrings, and Ocean is not Helen Louise Langdon Norton Little. um, because I think we have to remember here the use of the word novel and the use of the word fiction, because I deliberately structured this as a work of fiction. Um, Ocean, in a way, represents, she knows what Helen Louise Langdon Norton is, and she represents that story. She, the way I put it is, she comes on stage in tribute to Helen Louise Langdon, and a whole generation of people. So she is that individual, and she is many other individuals of that period. And even as you ask the question, I'm taking a long time to answer, but the question really started me off because I think of Helen Louise, as you say, with so many names. And in a sense, that in itself is a fiction. Because think about it, she is Langdon, Norton, Little, the last names of three white men who whose names she inherited. So many of us are fictions walking around the place with names like Collins and others. Yeah. And I thought of that, especially on one occasion when my brother was stopped. In fact, on more than one occasion, he was stopped at an airport and held there while they questioned him because he has the complete name of someone in the IRA. So, you can just say, well, look at me, I'm not a white man. But he is walking around with that name that is a historical fiction. Right? So he is Collins from Grenada. And you cannot sit there and give them a whole story on the post colonial and, colonial. You are this fictional person. So I was thinking about that as I created as Ocean invited me to talk to her, because she is, in fact, a representative of all of that stirring of the Atlantic Ocean. She's not only Louise.
Wow. What a way to start. Thank you very much for that. Kasua?
Yeah, definitely looking forward to this conversation today. Just kind of building on what you just said about sort of choosing to write fiction. I guess my question is, what do you think the possibilities are when you take these characters from history and fictionalize them? And you've obviously written on Louise today. Sorry, for this novel. But you've previously written about, in your first novel, Angel, about the Grenadian Revolution. But you've also written about that subject academically. I'm just coming back to the same question. I'm just extending it. What do you think Black historical fiction in particular offers, and that you've chosen to kind of delve into it?
Right. Again, you're coming with some straight questions. When I'm attracted to the notion of historical fiction because it seems to me that there is so much that we inherit, that we live by, that is responsible for our socialization coming out of the colonial story that we do not often consider. Sometimes we talk glibly of the post-colonial and of revolution without really understanding ourselves as people shaped by the colonial and not looking at, the tiny details of what that means. So I'm not saying that I have all the answers, but because I am attracted to that kind of historical research, I always think at the end of researching some topic, um, well, I have the opportunity to do this, but this is not for me alone. How can I make it available to a wider group? And for me, that is often where fiction comes in. For example, after sitting in the Public Records Office in London and seeing how many hangings took place at the market square in St. George's, Grenada, I stand in the market and I'm thinking, oh my gosh, we're here shouting for two bunch of time, what carrots, whatever. And really, in a sense, not thinking of how we got here, So I find myself wanting to put into a novel somewhere the story of someone called John Bull, who was hanged in the marketplace, an enslaved man, things like that, because it is like we are walking on all of this history all the time, and not really knowing it, not really considering it, not really considering how, as individuals, the stratification that exists, for example, in the working classes, the stratification that exists among Black people. Some people feeling more important because they have, as Louise Langdon would have said, a little more color, that kind of thing. And to me, a lot of the answers to these things, a lot of those answers are in history, and I feel that I can use them in fiction.
I'm a historian who uses fiction a lot in my teaching for exactly those reasons. It's democratizing. It allows you to see things from a very different perspective. And I think authors have long told stories that historians, particularly of the Caribbean or the Black experience, have not always been able to do from a Black perspective. So I really enjoyed that answer. Thank you so much for answering that question.
Thank you. Thanks for asking it.
Francine?
Yeah, something you said interested me, so I'm kind of gonna hop ahead in the sequence, Roger. You talked about, the impact of the colonialism that we lived under and how our history impacts us. So I wanted to talk a bit about the royal reader, which you place heavy reliance on throughout the novel. Was there anything about the royal reader in particular that arrested your interest apart from the facts that, as you told us in your afterword essay, Louise Langdon and your own mother and grandmother were able to quote long passages from? What is it about the royal reader that made you rely so heavily on it as a literary device in the novel?
Right. I think that very fact. And I don't see it as something that's small. I When I read how Wilfred Little talked about things that his mother said I thought not only about the royal reader, but about notions of home and diaspora. Because here are these children who are really growing up, in a sense, with aspects of a Caribbean education, of a Caribbean sensibility, and not really, well, I can't say knowing it, because later on Wilfred, in fact, certainly knows it, but not really feeling it at the time. But as I read so many things that he says, I'm thinking, oh my gosh, this is the royal reader. And to me, that is huge. People have talked about the way Louise Langdon was educated. In fact, in the autobiography, Malcolm X, in a really disturbing passage, actually writes that his mother had a very good education, and I'm not quoting him exactly, but in the passage he says he had no idea where she got it from, but she had that. And sometimes my father would beat her, he says. And then he says, she had this, because, she had this tremendous education, and sometimes she would be just putting smooth words on him, and he would get annoyed. And Malcolm writes, an educated woman, I suppose, cannot resist the temptation to, he doesn't say lord it over, but essentially, to show up an uneducated man. And I pause on that and I say, oh my gosh, the tone actually sounds like, well, I can understand why he beat her, because, she talking, she's sounding so important, etc. And I'm thinking, that tremendous education that everyone's talking about, as I research it, I say, I'm not seeing where she did something beyond the royal reader. Some researchers have said that she was a very educated woman, but nobody so far has shown me where she got this extra education from. And that makes me think of the ways in which, and when I say it's not a little thing, that makes me think of the ways in which, for example, my grandmother would be reciting bits from the royal reader. And when my grandmother says, William the Conqueror, the fourth son of the Duke of Normandy, he married Matilda, it's not so much the content. It's not only the content. And I realized that later. It's not just that she's reciting history, but she has these very precise kind of rhythmic formulations as she recites history. And I'm thinking, okay, is this a kind of free verse rendition? Is there something else happening here with the, rhythmic structure that she presents? And many times I pause and try to think of the sort of declamatory notes, tones, etc., in that rendition. And I say there's something else happening here. I don't know if it's her teachers, if it's something ancestral, I don't know. But that education, the royal readers, clearly were perhaps interpreted in ways they were not intended to be by the colonial project. So that even when Sparrow sings Dan is the man in the van, and you're thinking, all right, this is a send-up of the royal reader, of course, because you're getting all of that. But then I also think of how Sparrow himself uses his royal reader education in that kind of structuring, And then I think of how Merle Hodge, who also critiques the royal reader for presenting images and class experiences that are not those of the children in the classroom. But I've heard Merle also make the comment that that simple thing, those simple structures, give something basic, give the children something basic. And Merle, if you're listening to this and say, when did I say that? Send a note. But, and that also makes me think of how people turn the intent of the colonial project that we're getting in these royal readers, how those who receive it, without perhaps without structuring it and saying, oh, I'm going to mess this up. They, in fact, change the things. When the children take Byron's poem and they're skipping and doing different things with the rhythms of Byron's poem that they get from the royal reader, I'm thinking, there's a transformation happening here. I need to think more about this transformation. And of course, I think of something like the Shakespeare Mass, which is in Carriacou, and I'm saying it is and is not Shakespeare. So that idea of using those basic readers, for something transformative, I wanted to get at in Ocean Stirrings.
Thank you for that. So I wanted to talk a bit more about like the narration of the novel. So although the primary narrator of the novel identifies itself as the quote unquote spirit of the place, for the first half of the novel, it sounds like the voice of a child. And in the second half, it sounds like the voice of a woman. In fact, although we are presented with a third person primary narrator, the narration felt like the voice of Ocean at whatever point in her life we were seeing her. Was that your intention? And did you ever consider writing this novel with Ocean as its only narrator?
Right. Again, fabulous question. Um, when in the novel, when I get to Ocean in the novel, and Ocean begins presenting her perspectives as a child, and later on, I think there are ways in which this could be Ocean's story. But from the beginning, it's not. It is and is not, in the sense that she is not narrating in the beginning. When Spirit of the Place first appears, in a sense, more than a child's voice, it is a sort of disembodied spirit voice. Because this is a point where people are talking about the pregnancy of Ocean's mother. So in the community, there's all kinds of gossip, and there's, and so there are all of the questions. She's pregnant. Whose child is this? And all of that, and all of the gossip. And this is when Spirit of the Place almost kind of turns to us, readers, listeners, and says, introduces self, introduces that spirit self and says, let me tell you this story. And I'm not quoting the novel exactly here, but this kind of, I am spirit of the place. How sometimes you think you see something and you turn around quick and there's nothing there. And that is the time when sometimes people say walls have ears and things like that. Well, I am the ears that walls have. And I am the eyes. People don't say that, but walls have eyes too. And I am the eyes that walls have. So in a sense, spirit presents self as something spiritual, all right? That kind of spirit making, that kind of sense of things that Ocean might have some of as she grows up, but the Spirit of the Place knows a lot more than Ocean does. In a sense, it is a sort of disembodied, omniscient narrative perspective. And notice how throughout the novel, in other places, you have the mention of people saying things about their spirit. And I intend that their spirit deliberately too, so that, for example, if spirit of the place were recounting the story Jericho's from Jupiter's perspective. Jupiter was the grandfather, who is not named in, in the novel, but Jupiter was. So if the spirit of the place were recounting that story, it would be about other things, about the boats and, the actual crossing and those kind of things, because spirit has a different sense of things, a more comprehensive sense of things. And yes, the person who is the person whose story it is mainly, spirit stays close to that person. So yes, spirit is very much there with Ocean when, for example, she becomes mentally very fragile, and spirit is saying, hey, I've been walking with her. And in a sense, it's telling Ocean too, keep up your spirit. You know how people say, keep up your spirit? So that sense, I wanted that sense to be there in the novel. So yes, spirit of the place is not Ocean. It is, in every sense, the spirit of the place. And I think of sayings like, a spirit and give with her, spirit. So that notion of spirit I wanted to keep.
In the novel, I think you make clear to something that a lot of people might not be aware of, which is that there's the kind of understanding that I think other scholars and yourself have, is that although she was in an institution for a very long time, many people believe that she shouldn't have been there, that she was sequestered there against her will and with no real cause for decades. And is there something about the way that sort of institutions are used to sort of, as prisons are for men, mental institutions are for women, that you wanted to draw attention to there, or is there another reason why you put that in the novel in the way that you did? I think.
Yes, I wanted to draw attention to that. And not only, yes, how prisons are used for women. I also wanted to draw attention to Black women. So in a sense, it's both race and gender there. And when there's a writer called Jessica Russell who interviewed Hilda, Louise Langdon's daughter. I saw this when I had already submitted the novel. But I thought about the ways in which Jessica Russell is looking at she gets information from Louise Langdon's daughter, which is interesting to me because the boys were writing all the time, Malcolm and Wilfred. But this interview with the daughter, who was, just a year or two younger than the first son, Wilfred, and she obviously had access to material coming out of the mental institution and so. And what seems to me clear there is that Louise Little was very fragile, mentally fragile, when she was committed to the institution. And when I say mentally fragile, the way in which today we talk about mental health issues, just mentioning, for example, that many young people going through COVID had mental health issues. I know that's a narrative here in the US, and I'm sure it's a narrative throughout the Caribbean as well in different ways. But I think that there in 1938, by that point, Louise Little had gone through so much in her life as woman, as Black woman, as a woman looking for some kind of relationship after the death of her husband, as a woman with 7 children trying to take care of them at a point when social services are not sympathetic, when the insurance doesn't even want to give her the money that her husband, um, tried to ensure would exist for his family after he died. And it seemed to me clear that, he knew that Black men had a short lifespan, generally, and he had that concern and he wanted to leave something, all of that. And then the social workers gave her a really rough time. Then she is out there trying to go to work, trying to find something to do. Remember, she is a woman, very light skinned, so could, quote unquote, pass for white. So she's trying to go to work as a seamstress. She is trying to work in houses, doing domestic work at times. But if the children should pass by, and we're getting this from the sons, if the children should pass by the house and the people who employ her would see the children coming and think, oh, those are her children, then she's a Black woman. She would lose the job immediately. So when you get that kind of recounting and you think how she is struggling to survive at a time when the state, the institutions of the state, and approaches, attitudes to race, class, etc., would not let her survive. I'm thinking, at that point, yeah, you got to be fragile. There's no support around. And then her son says, I asked a psychologist what to do. This is the 18-year-old one, the oldest one, 17, 18 at the time. And the psychologist said, she needs to let go completely. She needs to be given complete rest and she'll be okay in a while. So that's what I really believe at that point, that she was fragile. But if she had support, she didn't have to end up in an institution. And to tell you how much the institutions of the state did not support her, by this time, the state, they're also trying to take their land from them because they had built a house in an area marked as, what was said was that only Caucasians should live in this area. So they're trying to take their house from them, and she has all of these other issues. Of course, she was mentally fragile, as far as I see it. But then they pick her up and take her to the institution, and I believe in there, with the treatment, I don't know exactly what the treatments were, but it's obvious that she had, drugs put into her, etc., etc. And I think that she lost a sense of herself inside of the institution.
Yeah, I think I saw an interview with the daughter. I wonder if it's the same daughter. I think it might be Hilda's eldest daughter, where
Yes.
she talks about she thinks her mother had electric shock treatment. But one of the big surprises was that I think when she was released, she still managed to live quite a long time, and she was quite lucid in her older age, despite everything she'd experienced. So her grandchildren knew her, which is incredible given what she experienced, really.
Absolutely. So you kind of think of that story and that strength. So, she fascinated me, and I thought it's not like taking another person's story and doing this to me. It is about women generally and the treatment of women. And as far as her story is concerned, I know some people went to the story expecting perhaps something different. But as far as the story is concerned, I really wanted to focus on women, use her story as an opportunity to focus on women of the Caribbean, that kind of migration and diaspora, what people are giving to their children, whether the children recognize it or not, and those issues. So yes, I don't believe that she was in a state to be committed when they dragged her out of her house to put her in the mental institution. But I think that she became less and less able to care for herself within the institution?
I want to go a little bit back in history now because you mentioned the grandfather and what his story would have been about.
Mm-hmm.
So, in the novel, you point to the fact that there's a great deal of uncertainty about which, if any, of her forebears was a liberated African. Maybe it was the grandfather, maybe it was both of her grandparents. It's not clear, yet you seem to have thought it important to refer to that possibility. Can you tell us why?
Yeah, I did think it important to refer to that possibility, partly because, again, we come to the idea of the documentary novel. And as I interviewed family members, I got from some, not from all, not from members here. Not everyone kind of wanted to, or approaches to kind of putting things in public. But I got from members, from people in Grenada, whom I interviewed, and I can pause here to say thank you, Terence. But from people in Grenada whom I interviewed, that the oral history was that members of the family were liberated Africans. I am not clear really whether it was for the grandfather or grandmother. The suggestion was that both were liberated Africans. I am not sure. I tried to follow that story and I see where a boat came in the 1860s and where a Langdon man was, a Langdon colonial official was one of those, who took people off the boat and farmed them out to estates in that St. Andrews area. So that is certainly possible then. But I did not get any sort of definitive information. Well, perhaps I have to say written information. And here we come to the oral and the written to back up the oral stories that I was hearing. So I thought, I'm not going to use this. I'm not going to have Ocean definitely saying that her grandparents were liberated Africans. And so this is the form of the documentary novel again, and trying to think through this. But it's also that I'm aware that within the community in Grenada, certainly, and perhaps within Caribbean communities generally, there are people who would rather say that their ancestors were liberated Africans than say that they were enslaved. So I thought, if I had a definitive information here, I might do that. But really, I want to use this opportunity for Ocean to realize that it really doesn't matter whether they were liberated or enslaved. We're talking about African people and valorizing that African history. And I talked to Ocean, and she said, "Yeah, that's how it is in truth," And so that's why I left that uncertainty, because to some extent, it's the uncertainty that many Caribbean people have as we are researching histories. There comes a point where you have to stop. And also, I have done some research. I was invited by someone to do research on their family. And there's a point where it was not possible to go beyond, right? You know that this woman came from Tobago to Grenada, and you trying to go back beyond Tobago. Something in that story makes you think, okay, these were the Akan. But again, you don't have the definitive information on the other side. So thinking of all of those struggles, I decided to let Ocean herself do what she wanted to do, which was keep wondering, what exactly is the story here?
Can I just jump in?
Sorry.
Can I just jump in here and say, I know that I found out about the kind of concept, if you like, or existence of liberated Africans quite late in my life. I feel like a lot of Caribbean people, we understand ourselves to be, or those of us of African heritage to be, the descendants of enslaved people, and this kind of other categories of Africans arriving on our shores it's really kind of new. And I wonder if you could kind of maybe just talk very briefly about what it is to be a liberated African. I also think, from what I do know, that the term liberated African is a little bit of a misnomer, because from what I understand, they're not always as liberated as the name suggests, if you like. But if you, I just wonder if you could expound more for anybody who's listening who doesn't know, who's never heard of this before.
Fabulous. And, I love it when the question also suggests a bit of the answer, and I'm getting that there. Also sitting, and a lot of this research was done, yes, in the Public Records Office in London. So I am sitting there. And of course, I was pushed to that by other things I'd seen and heard elsewhere. But I'm sitting there and find a list of people from a ship, a Portuguese ship, on its way past Caribbean islands, going into Brazil. And the British stopped the ship on the high seas. That's just one example of the liberated Africans thing. The British, and that ship was called the Negrina. The British stopped the ship on the high seas and say, hey, you're not supposed to be trading in slaves, because this is after Britain got this awakening. And we know that that's a misnomer. We know that's not how it happened. But this is after the slave trade, not slavery, was abolished. So between that period, which is between 1807 and 1834. So during that period, a lot of ships going to Spanish ports, going to Portuguese ports, etc., was stopped on the high seas. And in this particular case, when they stopped the Negrina, you see, I'm looking at the list and seeing names. And the names they have a list of African names, and I use that idea too in this work. So you're actually seeing the African names. And then since they stopped the ship, right near to the African names on this list is the European name, So they would have an African name, and next to it, you suddenly see Tom John, to give just a simple thing, because Tom John is one of the men on the ship that stopped them, or something. So you see that sudden transformation from African names to things. And I'm only seeing this. I don't see this for the so-called slave ships, right? You don't see names in that sense. You just finally see a list of names on an estate somewhere. But in this particular case, when ships are stopped on the seas and people are, quote unquote, liberated, in that particular case with the Negrina, I got names, African names, European names, and those are the headings. Yeah, African names at the top, European names on the other side. So you get that sudden transformation. But also, when they take these people who were bound for Brazil, who would have been slaves in Brazil, what they do is look around to their estates. And again, there I would put that in comillas, in inverted commas. They look around to their estates in the Caribbean and say, all right, Grenada needs some. Trinidad also needs some for labor, Guyana, wherever. So they are sending people, the so-called liberated Africans, right? Because they have liberated them from the Portuguese ship. They are sending them to estates that need labor. So they're not called slaves. They're called liberated Africans because, hey, no, Britain did this wonderful thing. It liberated these people who are going to be slaves on estates in Brazil. And we can say perhaps they had a little better conditions in the sense that they're not recognized as slaves on these estates. They are recognized as liberated Africans. Okay?
So we're essentially out of time, but I
Okay.
think but I think there's one thing that we'd all like to find out as we're talking about the history and legacy of enslavement in Grenada. So early in the novel, the children are playing a game called Up and Down the Deck, which is inspired by the community's unarticulated memory of enslavement. Is that a real Grenadian children's game?
Yes, it's a game I grew up playing. Up and down the deck, keep moving. So we all, and of course, it's a lot of laughter. There's no sense of that as a memory. We're moving up and down the yard or wherever, but metaphorically, we're on a deck, on the deck of a ship. So it's call and response. The captain says up and down the deck, and everybody's answering, keep moving. So it's up and down the deck, keep moving, up and down the deck, keep moving, up and down the deck. And then suddenly you hear the voice say boom overhead. And when it's boom overhead, the boom of the ship would be swinging around there. So that's the point where everybody, with a lot of laughter, we fall to the ground. Because, of course, if that boom hits you, you can fall off into the sea. So it's years after playing that game in the yards, thinking about it, I thought, oh my gosh, that is a memory. That game is a memory game. So I have one of the teachers, Christine Clarkson, now deceased, who I know used that game in the classroom. And there was a poem that I wrote about it, and I know that she talked to me about it and used that um, in her classroom. And as I mentioned, you, Christine, rest good. um, so it's that idea. And for me, it's the idea that there are other things around that are memories. And we have to figure out, well, we don't have to, but to me, it seems important to figure out how we carry those memories in our stories, in our lives, how they exist on the playground, in this case.
Thank you very much. And to our viewers, by Merle's sort of depiction of the game up and down the deck, I'm sure you could tell that she's a wonderful performer. And as a treat, as this is our last program of the year, we're going to present to you a reading by Merle Collins from her novel, Ocean Stirrings. Thank you for joining us.
Excerpt from a letter written by Oceane to her dead grandmother when she's on the boat to Canada in 1917. Sea letter. All the ship's officers are dressed up like the one I told you about. One of them even had a chain coming across from sort of inside the jacket, and I guess a watch hanging near to a button at the front. Watch it tomorrow, Ma, when I'm near them. If I see them again, you will know and see who I mean. All the ship's officers are well dressed up, and all of them are white men. I suppose it's a good thing Auntie Judah got a berth for me, but it's so fancy and there's no black people with berth this time, although Uncle Ero said it had one or two of them when he was traveling. I see a lot of black people. I mean, fair skin too. Not on deck, out on deck. In fact, I see only one other black. She could be black, very light skinned lady in the section with berths, but we don't talk or anything. She really looked like Munkinilaja, people with money. She might be white, I don't know. I can hardly understand what the white people say when they talk, but I heard one lady saying something about how she came on the ship from Canada and went down to Trinidad, and now she's going back up on it. So she and her group must be tourists, and they're in high up company. I hear them call the name of one of the high up people Uncle Ero tell us about, Geddes Grant. The lady was talking as if they met him in Trinidad and then he was with them in Grenada. I don't think he's on this boat, though. I just sit and listen as if I'm not there, and they're not even seeing me. Perhaps I'm like a OHMS letter, the one with the border, and on His Majesty's Service letter. You never know what's inside. What a thing. You're smiling. You're smiling, Ma. I could feel you smiling at me. And I'm glad for that. I'm glad for that. I miss you, Ma. We could just travel together and watch them and hear what they're saying. Stay with me, Emma.